Good evening and welcome to this Monday evening's edition of Tiski Sam. My name is Aaron Bastani. I have the great pleasure of being joined by the ever-dashing, the immarketable Michael Walker at Michael J.S. Walker. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you for the introduction. Looking forward to the Iowa caucuses.
They're going to come through They're coming through in the next couple of hours. Apparently one's already come through.
Yeah, but I think we get the results at 1 a.m, so 5 hours.
Yeah. But
7 p.m. in the States.
Fox was saying that one precinct's already through, and it's very positive for Bernie, isn't it? Overwhelmingly positive news for Bernie Sanders. In any case, tonight we'll be discussing what Bernie Sanders can learn from Labour's big defeat, it's fair to say, from last December. As well as that, we'll be talking about the recent events and gossip of the last few days, from Lisa Nandy sharing tea with Tony Blair in 2016 as she co-chaired Owen Smith's campaign and oversaw parts of the chicken coup, to the fact that Keir Starmer will commit to tax increases on the rich, but not to public ownership. Anyway, let's start with Bernie. The campaign for Bernie Sanders is really hitting the ground. It's really nailing it. This is a piece from Time magazine, we can get this up, really conveys the extent to which they're pulling away, it seems, in Iowa. It seems that Bernie could win by quite a significant margin tonight. Quote, we've got this coming up. Bernie Sanders was standing on stage at the US Cellular Center in Cedar Rapids on Sunday night in front of 3,000 cheering supporters waving blue and white signs as Vampire Weekend began riffing behind him. Didn't know Vampire Weekend still existed, but there you go. Blast from the past. It was, according to Sanders' campaign, the largest rally any presidential candidate has held in Iowa this cycle, and the impressive turnout was backed up by a similarly sweeping ground game. The campaign hit its goal of knocking on 500,000 doors ahead of the first in-the-nation caucuses on Monday, Sanders told the audience in his speech. 500,000 doors. And while there were failures around the Labour campaign from last December, one thing we know it was quite effective at was gently bumping up Labour's vote during the course of the campaign. That's a variable, isn't it? That's got to be taken seriously, 500,000 doors being knocked.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we found out of this general election is it's not a sufficient condition for winning a general election, but if other things are going right, then obviously knocking on 500,000 doors is going to make a difference, right? I mean, I think that one thing that's incredible in terms of the primaries is that Bernie Sanders has raised more money than anyone else. You know, as we've learned from Bernie Sanders, there are 3 billionaires with more wealth than the bottom 50% of the American population, and yet they haven't managed to. You know, you'd have thought at least the establishment candidate would have more money than Bernie. Obviously, Bernie's going to have more people knocking on doors, but they're so sort of lackadaisical that they haven't funded Pete Buttigieg to the same degree that Bernie Sanders has been by ordinary people. You know, you'd have thought at least they can outspend him. Come on.
Like AOC says, they've got money, we've got people. It's like, well, actually, Sanders got money.
Yeah, sick.
Yeah. Oh, do you think that's why we'll talk about this more over the course of the show? Do you think that's a function of just how poor the candidates are? Other than Bernie.
Yeah, in the sense that, there's no obvious. Well, I mean, it looks like the obvious one is Biden, but he's obviously such a weak candidate because he can't string a sentence together. So I mean, money doesn't know who to organise around at this point in time, right? Because you've got Buttigieg, who's way behind. He's running a pretty stale campaign. I think we're going to look at one of his videos in a moment. I mean, he's talking about a new politics that needs bold action. You know, it's a bunch of
platitudes.
It's a bunch of platitudes. I can't find. Oh, there's a hunger for a new kind of politics defined by belonging, boldness, action. It's loads and loads of buzzwords, no content whatsoever. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere. He's sort of. I watched a speech of him in Iowa, and he's really aping Obama. But he looks so much like a knockoff version of Obama that what's the point?
Yeah.
But maybe that's right. Maybe once there's a clear challenger to Bernie Sanders, then the money will, mobilize around them.
I think that's smart.
And American rich people do have more to spend than millions of American ordinary people because of the extent of wealth inequality in that country. So if the billionaires do rally, they should be able to outspend Sanders.
And it's also just a function of just defending your own interest, because you get lots of highly wealthy people who literally donate money to the leading candidate of each party. And it may just be a case, obviously they're not going to fund Sanders because he's going to increase their taxes, but they want to hedge their bets in terms of who enters the White House next, maximise their interest. They'll fund whoever the leading contender other than Bernie is. Let's get this, there's the polling up from Iowa so far. This is on Axios, if we can just pull this up. The Sanders surge shapes the Iowa caucuses. Now, as you can see, this is really interesting because it offers some historical context. As we've just been saying, Sanders is doing much better in terms of money raised, ground campaign, polling, everything. And this is what Iowa matters. You might be thinking, Iowa, it's not California, it's not New York, it's not Florida, it's not Chicago. Why would this be such a bellwether, such an important place in determining who the eventual Democratic nominee will be? Well, as you can see, Clinton in 2016 won there, Obama won there, Kerry won there, Gore won there. I think you have to go all the way to Dukakis in 88. No, Dukakis was the candidate. So, I mean, maybe somebody can look at this data and tell me the last time it wasn't somebody. Mondale was the candidate in 84. So, fundamentally, yeah, you can see, I think that's pretty much showing it, isn't it? All the way through to 72. Whoever wins in Iowa then goes on to win the nomination. You tell me.
No, that's not quite right.
Go on.
I think you've misread the chart somewhat. So Clinton came first.
Yep.
Obama came first.
Yep.
Kerry came first. Gore came first. Bill Clinton in 1992 came third in Iowa. Dukakis in 1988 came third in Iowa.
Right.
That's
So we're going through to 2000.
Yep.
And then Jimmy Carter came second. McGovern came third. So it's more of a recent phenomenon then.
Yeah, well, it's a bellwether state to the extent that it gives you momentum. So I think there's only 1% of delegates who are sort of pledged in Iowa, but because it's always been the first primary that happens, or it's a caucus actually. So instead of you going to a polling booth, you go.
What's the difference in a caucus, a primary?
So a primary is like an ordinary election. You go to a polling booth and you just tick your box. A caucus is you go to sort of like a community hall and you have surrogates for all the different candidates who sort of take a corner and they're trying to draw undecided people to their corner. So you have a Sanders corner, a Biden corner, a Klobuchar corner, and the people who are automatic supporters of those candidates go to that corner. Other people will be in the middle hearing the various arguments in the room. So it's quite an exciting way of doing democracy. I'd love to go to one. But
this is when de Tocqueville talks about America and associational democracy. This is what he means, right? It's quite an organic living process.
And historically, Bernie Sanders did better in caucuses last time around. I think so did Obama, because they were the candidates, with a motivated activist base who were able to go into rooms and really make the argument for them.
Right. I think, is it New Hampshire or Iowa that tends to be more indicative of the ultimate winner, historically? Obviously, in recent years, it's Iowa.
I don't know the answer to that question.
New Hampshire's the next one. In any case, these are the two races that really set the agenda. Partly explains why Pete Buttigieg has barely any sort of plan beyond Iowa and to a lesser extent New Hampshire.
Yeah. Apparently, Mike Bloomberg is doing a strategy which is to say completely ignore the early states.
Yeah.
And he is going heavily in terms of advertising on the Super Tuesday state. So the Super Tuesday state is March the 3rd. That's when you get lots of, I think about a third of the delegates are pledged then because there's some big states that come up. So that's when we'll really start to get a sense of who the candidate will be. So Mike Bloomberg is trying to, overthrow this system whereby normally Iowa gets you first. So that's because he was a late runner and he doesn't have many people on the ground, so he just has to spend his ad money. He thinks it's going to pick up the most
pledged delegates. Explain to our audience the difference between pledged delegates and unpledged delegates and what the whole process means, how it culminates with the ultimate nomination.
Yeah, so you have 4,000 odd delegates at the National Convention, and they are decided by these primaries in different states. So, for example, if Bernie Sanders wins a third of the votes in Iowa and Buttigieg wins a quarter and Warren wins a quarter, etc., then a third of the delegates from Iowa will go to the Democratic National Convention, which votes on who will be the presidential candidate, and a third of the delegates from Iowa will vote for Sanders. So they're pledged delegates. If, say, a quarter of them vote for Warren and then Warren drops out, then those quarter will become unpledged delegates. And they, if Warren endorses Sanders, then they should go over to her. Then if in the first round of voting at the Democratic National Convention, no candidate gets over 50%, then you have a second round where I think formally then all the delegates become unpledged, but I think they're still supposed to vote for their candidate. But what's important at that point is that the superdelegates come in. Superdelegates are unelected. They are either senators, or I suppose they're elected by the US population, but they're not elected in the primary process, or sort of big names in the Democratic establishment. So that was the superdelegates came under a lot of scrutiny in the Clinton versus Sanders primary in 2016 because people felt that they were subverting the will of the Democratic membership. I mean, Hillary in the end...
Which is what they do, right?
Hillary in the end did win the popular vote. in the primary process, as well as.
But also with, I mean, in
super delegates.
2008, in the race between Obama and Hillary, it was a similar dynamic in so much as Obama was always, doing really well with the pledged delegates, and it was always, oh, well, she'll win all the super delegates, so it kind of doesn't matter, which is interesting. And also, there's the argument, and this is going to be really key over the progression of the race, is that Sanders will need to win a majority of the pledged delegates. He'll need to win a majority of the people, undertaking this democratic process. And if he just wins a plurality, which is to say, let's say he gets 45% of the overall pledged delegates and everybody else, obviously gets less than him. If he doesn't win an overall majority, the argument then is that the Democratic establishment would then give the super delegates to somebody else.
Exactly.
So he really has to knock this out of the park to ensure that he's the
he needs to win in the first round.
Yeah, he needs to do a KO, first round KO, Conor McGregor style. He can't string this out like last time. He can't sort of invert what Hillary did to him even. He would kind of struggle if it's even remotely close. So we talked about all that. Before we go any further, you're watching Novara Media. This is Tisky Sour. My name's Aaron Bastani. I'm joined as ever by my far better looking co-host, Michael Walker. He should be. He's significantly younger. If you like what you're watching, hit the subscribe button. We want to do more and more coverage. We will be doing more and more coverage, not just we want to. We have the means to, regarding the US presidential race all the way through to the election itself later this year. Tomorrow, you'll be talking, we hope, to Crystal Ball.
We hope, yeah.
We hope. Maybe I shouldn't have leaked that.
You shouldn't have leaked that because we haven't got total confirmation.
It's not, well, look, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll be able to watch, we hope, Crystal Ball. And right now, how many people we've got watching? About 1,000? 943, but only 147 hitting that thumb button. I want you to do one thing, which is to hit the thumb button. Nothing else for now. Just hit the thumb button. Helps us obviously find an even bigger audience. Really appreciate it. And of course, you can go to support.novaramedia.com if you like what you're watching to help us continue to grow as an outlet. Going to be very, very needed. So let's just talk quickly about the other campaigns, because they're increasingly bordering on comedy, aren't they?
Yeah,
Buttigieg, Biden. We're going to go to this video of Buttigieg, right? Let's look
at the video. That's the one that I...
Is this the one that's going to demonetize the video? Okay, well, let's do it.
When this campaign started, we didn't know where it would take us, but we knew where we wanted to go.
So Iowa, are you ready to bring this country together?
The old style of politics is broken.
Keep on dividing.
We can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results.
We are obliged to serve the poor and heal the sick and clothe the naked and welcome the stranger. Stranger, by the way, being another word for immigrant. What we're seeing right now in the White House is the opposite.
There's hunger for a new kind of politics, defined by belonging, boldness, action.
I believe in Pete because of what he stands for.
I believe that he can bring us together rather than dividing us.
Pete believes that we should pay teachers like doctors and respect them like soldiers.
And February 3rd is our shot to turn the page to what comes next.
So, Michael, you said those immortal words, those epically meaningless words. There's a hunger for a new kind of politics defined by belonging, boldness, action. Do you think Buttigieg is going to sort of just get laughed out of town? Is he going to get hammered, disappear in a month or two? Or do you think the guy's here to stay?
I don't like to make predictions, but it seems like it, doesn't it? I mean, he just doesn't seem like a particularly substantial figure. I also don't think he'd do particularly well against Trump. I mean, because his whole thing is, I'm an Afghanistan veteran. I don't know how long he went there. I think he'd already sort of like done various politics degrees. It's clear that he has been sort of, designing a CV so that he can run for president. And yeah, I'm not sure how much is there. I'd have thought he would have put just a few more sort of like policies in his videos, because there are promises you can make as to how you're going to change America in a way which doesn't necessarily lose you, friends in the corporate establishment. And it just seems like he kind of hasn't really bothered so much. I don't know if it was in that video where he had the line that we're going to start paying teachers as well as doctors and respect them as well as we do veterans. I thought that's a nice line, but it doesn't really rise to the challenge of the struggles that American people are going through right now. Yeah. It's not going to beat Trump, is it? Respect teachers.
No, that's the thing, because with Bernie Sanders, you've got a movement, you've got substantial policies, you've got a really big, credible record. With Joe Biden, well, I don't know what you've got. We're going to go to Joe Biden in a second, but he certainly hasn't got the movement. Let's go to that Biden video, actually. This is the Sunrise Movement, which is attached to Justice Democrats, kind of the left wing, of the Democrat movement, obviously, hugely connected to climate change, the success of the Green New Deal around the Democratic Party and the kind of hegemonizing it's had on the discussion around climate change on the left. Let's watch that attack video on Joe Biden.
Politicians can say whatever they want when they're running for office. Much more important to look at where the money is coming from. Exactly. Who are they actually going to fight for when they get there? How do we trust him? I mean, that's the bottom line here.
We are in this situation because fossil fuel CEOs and lobbyists have been buying out politicians for decades.
I'm just wondering how we can trust you when you've continually broken your pledge not to take fossil fuel money.
How can we trust you to hold these corporations and executives accountable for their crimes against humanity when we know that tomorrow you are holding a high-dollar fundraiser hosted by Andrew Goldman, a fossil fuel executive?
My good friend Joe Biden has recently said, and I quote, "Not a single solitary scientist," end of quote, agrees with my plan. Well, Joe, you're wrong. Many leading scientists agree with our plan because the scientists understand. We have a crisis and that we need bold and aggressive action, and we need it now.
Somebody just put it in the comments. How is Joe Biden still there?
He's there because no one else has become, the centrist candidate. So he's still managing to occupy that position, even though he performs terribly in debate. I mean, I suppose one reason why he's there is that people still see him as electable because of his association with Obama. But I think obviously he was vice president under Obama, but what that ignores is the fact that he is going to have to fight, a 6-month-long campaign against Donald Trump. And if he can't string a sentence together in a debate, it's sort of like if you're the Democrats, I don't know how you could possibly think. I mean, it's like looking at Trump's victory and saying the reason he got elected is because he can't string a sentence together. Let's put up someone who's, a bit less racist, but also can't string a sentence together. That wasn't Trump's strength. If he wins, the debates will be incredible because it will be completely incomprehensible.
That's probably it will be unbelievable.
It will be unbelievable.
But also, Biden, I mean, this is going to sound terrible. Biden's, I think, 70. I mean, Sanders is 78. Biden's 77, I think.
Biden's younger than Sanders, but Sanders is with
Biden,
it. Biden's lost it.
Biden's kind of definitely getting dementia.
I mean, he seems like he's probably getting dementia.
I mean, look, your cognitive faculties sort of slow down as you get older, but it's really discernible with Biden. He's not even the same guy. That's the thing. People are thinking, it's Biden, the vice president in 2008. It's a really different person. We were meant to go to a video regarding Sanders. Before that, I just want to pull up this story from NBC, the one below it, the story below it, Fox. And this is that John Kerry might run as the kind of Hail Mary pass, the savior, to make up for the Biden campaign. Now, this may not be happening, but the fact it's in circulation would kind of indicate that Biden could sink without a trace.
This early in the race as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not
before anything.
Well, I mean, what's funny as well is that he is still, it speaks so much to the weakness of Biden as a candidate that they're talking about, having a replacement candidate, even when he's still, he's joint first in the polls. It's not like he's tanked. It's that they know he's going to tank because they can recognize that he's not up for the job, that he's not really with it enough to be president. And people will find that out after they see him now instead of remembering him from 4 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, John Kerry, just people who aren't familiar with John Kerry, he was the Secretary of State, but before that, under Obama. A pretty good one as well, actually. I mean, before the ultra-left attacks me, he was good on some things like Iran and so on. But his kind of his entrance into national politics proper was running against George W. Bush as the Democratic nominee in 2004, and he got hammered. And so basically, John Kerry was Joe Biden 16 years ago, and if he couldn't beat George W. Bush, who was the definitely inferior politician to Donald Trump, in a number of ways, I think, if he couldn't beat him then 16 years ago, 16 years younger, he definitely can't beat him now. And the one weapon you've got on your side is youth movements, millennials. We'll talk about the millennial cohort as well. I saw this being said by Keir Milburn, friend of the show, author of Generation Left. And he said the millennial cohort in the US is actually a little bit older than here, and it's a little bit bigger. So over here, it's like a variable, right? It was enough, for instance, to, in Scotland with the indie vote, it's kind of just enough.
Why is it older there?
Not old. Forget the language. There's a big bulge.
Yeah.
Basically amongst the oldest millennials. So in the early 80s, there's a lot of these older millennials, even though it's a huge age cohort, basically, is anybody born from 80 to 95. But basically, in the American millennial cohort, it's much bigger, but it also tends towards these oldest people. And so these age cohorts, they're often they're seen as marketing shticks. They're not. There was a huge baby boom in the United States, the boomers, straight after the Second World War. There is a generational cohort in the US. It's primarily a US phenomenon, which is as big as the baby boomers. It's a very, very big birth cohort in the US. And I suppose there's the argument there that the politics of trying to aim at these people probably is inadequate in Britain right now to win. The argument is that might not be the same in the US. I mean, we'll find out. If Bernie just sort of hits out of the park with the Democratic primary, then there's obviously a debate to be had there. But that's the strength that he has that a Kerry or a Biden or even a Buttigieg or even a Warren's not going to have. Let's see this video on Sanders and how even those who are pessimistic about his chances think he'll do extraordinarily well tonight. Let's go to that.
People got to figure out who the guy is. Yeah. I think I know because I've dealt with these guys most of my adult life. They're usually the guys at the card tables at an anti-war rally. There'll be some old guy with some old literature from this socialist party to that, trying to sell it, trying to latch on to the anti-war movement. There's always guys like that. And they're usually, as Howard Fine once said, non-negotiable demands, yelling up at the administration building during the anti-war movement. I know them, but I think the country's going to get to know them. I think we got a problem. We'll see. But, nobody's going to say it tonight. They're all going to be cheering. Good old Bernie. I think he's going to win big tonight. Real big. Real.
We've got somebody here saying, Alexander Reynolds, look at these fucking soy boys, hoping against hope that Corbyn is going to win the US election as compensation for being crushed in the UK ones. Soy boys. What is it? This is the kind of the myth that if you eat soy... I don't eat soy, by the way.
You don't eat soy?
No, I don't, even though I'm vegetarian.
The myth is that soy increases your estrogen.
Yeah, and there's a great video. There's a great video that debunks it by, again, another friend of the show. I've forgotten his name now. It's so long ago.
I haven't seen it.
It's not Philosophy Tube, it's the other guy.
H-Bomber Guy.
H-Bomber Guy. He did a great video. I watched it like 18 months ago when it came out. So if we're soy boys, okay.
I'm fine with that.
Fine with that. Enough of your pseudoscience. So that's interesting, isn't it? That was Chris, who was it on MSNBC? Chris Matthews. He's a centrist, right? I mean, I just watched that and I thought it was really intriguing. And he was depicting Sanders as like a kind of a Trotskyist.
Yep.
Somebody who was, selling papers 20 years ago outside, legitimate meetings of centre-left activists. But the reality is Sanders has been involved in the democratic process as a legislator for like 40 years. Yeah, it was a really odd thing to assert.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's a obvious thing to assert. I mean, it's what will be the attack against him. We saw also. I don't know if we've got that clip in of Donald Trump saying he looks like a.
I'm just going to come in later. Yeah,
but that is going to be the attack line against Bernie Sanders, that he's a communist, or that he's from the hard left, Trotskyite type person. And I mean, he's in a slightly stronger position than Corbyn because he has been a more senior legislator than Corbyn ever was. But I mean, this will come into play. And they will have to work out a response to it. So in terms of, as we'd called this, like lessons that the Sanders movement should learn from Corbyn, I think one of them would be on these arguments that he stood with Maduro or whatever, you're going to have to work out your line now, and you're going to have to stick to it.
Yeah.
Because what the Corbyn movement, for better or for worse, did is they sort of made it up as they went along, and it was a bit reactive. People took different lines.
Yeah.
When it came to the anti-Semitism row, some people were sort of saying like...
We'll talk about that.
We could go into that in a moment. And we'll do that a bit more in detail. But I suppose he has to be able to come out with a response and stick to it. And the Venezuela one is going to be the most interesting, actually, I think, because this is where Bernie Sanders... That's the attack line he went for. And in terms of Bernie Sanders' past, it is a lot of, backing South American movements, which the American mainstream media has, smeared as authoritarian dictators. And I mean, I think generally Bernie Sanders has been on the right side of history here, but he is going to have to work out how to explain that in a way that ordinary people understand.
But it's a bit different to Corbyn in so much as the IRA stuff with Corbyn, whatever your views on it, right, that they were undertaking terrorist attacks on the UK mainland. So, I mean, it's a bit different in so much as Bernie, I think, we're going to talk about this in a sec, but Bernie, I think, on the foreign policy stuff, can effectively articulate the same position as Trump in 2016 and 2015, 2016, which was, we've spent enough money on wars, we've lost enough young people, sending them overseas into conflicts they shouldn't be in. I think that's a really powerful line. I think people forget that one of the big attractions of Trump to people, sort of the right libertarian Alex Jones nut jobs. It's not a huge voter cohort in the US, but it's a big cultural phenomenon which infuses a broader part of the conversation on the right. Was that I'm not an establishment Republican because I don't want to go around bombing people for the sake of it. And so I think Bernie's a bit less vulnerable on that than Corbyn, although I agree with you. How do you think he should relate to the radical left? I think that's a broader problem for him, isn't it? Because we knew that Corbyn was a radical left politician, but he said, well, I'm happy to accept, we're going to keep Trident. I'm happy to adopt, the IHRA or whatever. But then there was always that line of, well, these people are saying this, and you're on the same side of them, same side as them, aren't you? How do you think Bernie Sanders should relate to the sort of radical left?
Well, I think what Bernie Sanders has to do is he has to be his own man, right? So he has to be both independent of the radical left and, obviously he's there to, he's saying I can only change things if there's a movement behind him. But he should recognise that also he has a shed load of room for manoeuvre to keep the radical left on side, So I do think he should be standing there saying, I don't care if this guy said this, I'm me, and this is my position, and I can confidently argue for this. Obviously, he has to make whatever he stands for now consistent with what he said in the past. That's going to be, the bigger challenge. I think it's completely manageable, but you're going to have to explain why you don't think that military intervention and regime change in governments that the establishment call dictators was not a good thing, and that means sort of talking in ordinary language about that. But yeah, in terms of the radical left, one thing, another bit of advice, I suppose, is that there was a narrative that emerged in the Labour Party that, if you don't adopt every policy that the left wants you to, that will really disempower them, they'll feel disengaged and they'll stop bothering to campaign for you. I think actually you've got a hell of a lot of leeway to sort of explain why you are going to adopt this policy but not that policy. And the bigger disappointment is always going to be if you have a historic loss, especially against someone like Donald Trump. So, be super smart. He needs to be independent both from the Democratic establishment and from the radical left, I think. And he has to, draw out his own path to winning majority in the United States, because that's not, you need a very professional, almost social scientific way to do that. He has to be looking in detail at swing states and think about how he wins those. You can't afford wishful thinking. And I do think that when it came to the Labour Party in 2019, there was quite a lot of wishful thinking that went on.
There was often, I think our political imaginary in this country is so shaped by the Iraq War. So it's like, if I'm a centre-left politician, I'm going to tell you the hard truths. And people are like, oh my God, we're going to be, completely, we're going to be sold down the river, we're going to be completely betrayed. Not necessarily, it may just mean, like you say, well, look, I actually support the decarbonisation target by 2030 personally, but we're going to make it 2035 or something like that. And here's why. Yeah. And I think that's what leadership is, right? Yeah. Let's go to a video of Donald Trump. And he perpetuated this precise attack line of Sanders being a communist. This was on a recent interview, I think, with Fox. Yeah.
Bernie Sanders. Well, I think he's a communist. Look, I think of communism when I think of Bernie. Now, you could say socialist, but did he get married in Moscow? And that's wonderful. Moscow's wonderful.
Might have been the honeymoon.
You don't think necessarily, well, whatever, but you don't necessarily think in terms of marriage, Moscow. And it's wonderful. I'm not knocking it, but I think of Bernie sort of as a socialist, but far beyond a socialist.
Elizabeth.
That was Trump in 20 seconds. Yeah. He asserts something just weird and puerile. But probably does connect. Wonderful. But he probably really connects. But then he's also got it wrong because he wasn't getting married as a honeymoon. He's like, whatever. And he's like, but look, it's great.
It's a really enjoyable clip, to be honest, isn't it?
That's pure Trump. Yeah. This is what people forget. I've said it for years. Everyone says we live in the information age. We don't. It's an entertainment age. The primary reason why Trump won in 2016. Forget the policies. Forget absolutely everything. I know our audience probably doesn't like to hear this. He was more entertaining than Hillary Clinton. He was more entertaining. People probably hate to hear that. And I think here's a question. Trump showed it there. His instinct is to just go. His default is to go for a really. Not populist, it's so puerile, a 12-year-old would understand what he's talking about. A literal 12-year-old will know what he's talking about. Oh, he got married in Moscow. Wow, that's interesting. That's different. When he was talking about Michael Bloomberg, I think it was the same interview, we didn't get this clip. And they said, Michael Bloomberg, and he said, what do you think? And he goes, I think short. And he starts talking about how short he is. And he says, they're going to bring a box out for Michael Bloomberg if he's going to take part in the debates. He gets a box. Why don't I get a box? He goes, that's not fair. And I'm like, Sanders is very good at shaping policy debates, but I wonder, in a one-on-one contest where that personality is so key, so critical, do you think he can outperform Trump? Or do you think that Trump will just... Because that's not his... For better or worse, that's not his shtick, right? So how do you think he responds to that? Or do you think he just kind of evades it?
Well, the thing with Sanders is it's not just he's good at policy, he's good at narrative. It's not the same narrative as Donald Trump. It's not as puerile, and it's not normally based on people's appearance, and it's not based on people's basest instincts. But when he's in a debate, or if he ever comes to be in a debate with Donald Trump, he's not going to be doing the Hillary Clinton thing, which is trying to insult Donald Trump for being insulting, and then talk about how you're the sensible, competent person.
No,
because that really gives him space to talk about that. What Bernie is going to be doing is talking about his vision for America. He's going to be calling out Donald Trump as a corrupt person in the pockets of billionaires, and I think people will probably find that fairly convincing. It will be different, I don't think, but I mean the person who'll be more like Donald Trump is Biden, because Biden sounds equally confused. But I suppose the difference is Donald Trump, when he sounds confused, he sounds completely like he doesn't care, like he's the happiest crazy guy in the world, like he's got total self-confidence. Whereas Biden, when he loses the sentence, he sometimes seems a bit like he's struggling and like he feels a little bit bad about it. So it's sort of a sign of weakness.
Biden does this weird thing. We've got none of these clips. Biden does this weird thing when people go, I'm not going to vote. I disagree with you about this or that policy. He goes, don't vote for me.
Yeah, I kind of like that.
And he has this thing, he started like jabbing people in the chest and stuff. This isn't good. Like, you shouldn't be doing this.
I kind of like the irritable thing. Well, the bit. I mean, obviously, I think Biden's a completely shit candidate, but I do kind of like the way he can show a little bit of leadership in the way that, I mean, Bernie can as well, which is, if someone tells him, are you going to ban fracking? He'll be like, no, there's loads of good jobs. So it's sort of
right.
He's quite confident in what he believes. He doesn't have to talk around it that much.
Yeah.
I think because of his experience, and he's like, I'm the electable candidate. I'm an old guy.
He's 77, doesn't care less. Yeah.
And I kind of rate that, even if I don't back the policy positions he uses it to justify. But that's not the same as being able to have a 6-month campaign against Donald Trump. He's okay in an argument with a 20-year-old. I
mean, a 6-month campaign of Biden versus Trump would be unreal. I mean, it'd be like taking like a gram of ketamine. Like all the walls are melting into like your limbs. Regardless of what Trump says about Sanders being a communist, we can pull this up. These are YouGov ratings, the latest ones around the most popular Democratic politicians in the United States. First, Barack Obama. Second, Jimmy Carter. Third, Bernie Sanders. Of course, Sanders is the only active politician of those three. The other two are previous presidents. Obama obviously won 2 terms. That bodes really well. Certainly doesn't tally with the claim of Hillary Clinton that, quote, nobody likes Bernie Sanders. And then we've got a poll of polls up on realclearpolitics.com, which shows Bernie doing really well. Doesn't tell the whole story because other Democrats are also leading Trump in some of these polls, like I think in the LA Times one, or maybe it's the Wall Street Journal one. Biden's lead over Trump is bigger than Sanders, but in most of the polls, Sanders is the Democrat outperforming Trump by the most. And there's this kind of thing that's saying, Sanders isn't electable. He's not personally popular enough. He wouldn't beat Trump. And actually, none of the data, look, the data could be wrong, but none of the data would indicate that. I mean, what do you think? Is that just people sort of repeating the hackneyed cliches we saw with that Chris Matthews guy, for instance, on MSNBC?
Well, I think the strongest argument probably for Biden in terms of electability is that he has indicated that he will adopt whatever policy positions seem most likely to beat Donald Trump. And so the worry you'd have as someone backing Bernie Sanders, obviously I'm someone who's backing Bernie Sanders, is that unless you have a very sort of hard-nosed scientific attitude to what potential weaknesses would I have in swing states and how do I account for those, and what compromises do I potentially make so that we don't just work out in 6th of November that this was going to be a millstone around our neck. So I suppose we'll talk about these in more detail in a moment, but that's the only way I can see in which Biden would be more electable, is that he is willing to do whatever it takes to get elected because he doesn't actually have any principles or beliefs. That could also undermine him potentially, but that is also somewhat of a strength because, if he employs the right people, they'll just draw up a platform which seems popular in the right places.
So do you think that this is a case of, given this is a show that we're trying to dole out advice to Americans in so much as we've experienced this before they have, we've learnt the hard way in Britain over the last couple of years. Given that Sanders is, and obviously he's at a very different stage to where Corbyn was in 2019. This is effectively what Jeremy Corbyn was going through in 2015 to win the party leadership. Given his personal approval ratings, given the fact that the American public thinks he can beat Trump, one wouldn't normally think that the United States is a particularly advantageous, hospitable environment for a centre-left politician. Do you think this is just a case of him being a better, more adept politician? Or is there more to it in terms of Sanders vis-a-vis Corbyn?
So a couple of things. I think he probably is a bit more of an adept politician. He can, we've talked about this on previous shows. He's got message discipline. He has got a narrative which cuts through a bit more than Corbyn did. And also, he didn't get into that position by accident. And Corbyn did, to a large degree, become or find the role he did by accident. It was his turn to stand to be Labour leader. Bernie Sanders obviously knew he was up for the job, and that's why he stood for it. But there are also differences. I mean, it's easier for Bernie Sanders to remain oppositional because of the party system. So he doesn't have to have Jeremy Corbyn knew that if he entered government, he'd have to choose his cabinet from within the Parliamentary Labour Party. Bernie Sanders can choose his cabinet from wherever he wants. So he can treat the Democratic establishment as somewhat irrelevant to his project of governing. Obviously, he's going to need them to vote for him in Congress and the Senate. But, he can come to them as his own man with his own team. And, they can't resign to try and get rid of him, for example. In the same way, Donald Trump did exactly the same thing. So Donald Trump had a campaign against the Republican establishment. No one in the Republican Party, their backing of him was muted, and some of them were in open rebellion. And the system allowed him to get through on those terms. Wealth inequality is much higher in America than here. Obviously, I think that we should have the sort of prerequisites for a class war to be both necessary and successful. But in the United States, it is much more obvious. And that's why, I was often talking throughout the last couple of years, really, talking to people, why hasn't Jeremy Corbyn got a memorable fact? But Bernie Sanders is that free people in America have more wealth than the bottom half of the population, than the bottom 175 million people. And he repeats that so often that people remember it. And there wasn't a similar, iconic stat in Britain. And I think in part that is because, wealth inequality here is gross and increasing, but it's not free people having the same as the bottom 50%. So I think it is more obvious in the United States.
There is a plutocracy in a way that there isn't here.
Yeah.
Right? Also, that's so true. Amazon is $1 trillion company.
Yeah.
Apple is $1 trillion company. Facebook, $500 billion. Google, $1 trillion. Microsoft, $1 trillion. There was a great statistic. I think in the late 1990s, Apple was worth 1/10 of Siemens, the German firm. Today, Apple is worth the combined value of the entire German DAX stock exchange. So that concentration of wealth and power, it's one of the great stories of the early 21st century. But you're absolutely right. I do also wonder, I think Sanders is a better communicator. But I do also wonder to what extent, if Sanders was, the leader of the Labour Party, and he had the exact same communicative capacities, ability to talk, regurgitate facts, etc., really cut through, to what extent would that be undermined by people like Wes Streeting and Jess Phillips? They were waging a psychological war on Corbyn for years. Clearly, I think stunting his growth as a leader, shaping it fundamentally for the worse. I do wonder to what extent, would he succeed anyway?
Well, because it would have been incredibly difficult because if you go, I suppose the argument for why Corbyn had to be conciliatory towards the Parliamentary Labour Party is because constitutionally, if he really pushed him, they could have broken away and become the official opposition. He would have still had the Labour Party brand and the Labour Party organisation, and potentially they would have, won the next election. But the centrists in the Parliamentary Labour Party could have formed the real Labour Party or the real Progressives or whatever, and that would have, obviously quite likely been fatal to the project. So Corbyn didn't have much choice but to be conciliatory.
I suppose this could be down the road, though, couldn't it? In so much as, let's say Sanders won the presidency, this is a million miles away. But then you've obviously got elections to Congress in 2 years' time, and establishment Democrats, it may be the case that establishment Democrats wouldn't vote through some of the policies that he wants. So that's obviously a clear argument to continue organising both within and against the Democrats. Exact same issue, obviously, here for Labour candidates and the membership base. The media. Here's one. So obviously right now we've got Boris Johnson, we've got a right-wing government bearing down on the BBC, talking about cuts, this pincer movement, right, of delegitimizing it, limiting its resources while also kind of helping allies like the Murdoch media.
Yeah.
Interesting strategy, and it's obviously working very well. Discipline.
So an example of this is that the Murdoch press is creating the Times Radio, which is going to be a competitor to Radio 4, and it's going to have a competitor to the Today programme.
Yeah.
The Conservative Party at the moment are kind of boycotting the Today programme.
As well as cutting their funding.
So they say, we are going to, give perks to your competitors who happen to be incredibly uncritical of us because they're owned by billionaires, and we're also going to try and delegitimize you in the public eye and cut your funding. So it's on the one hand sort of threatening them to be more compliant, whilst if they're not more compliant, saying well then we'll just give you a 10% cut and you'll have to get rid of all your investigative reporters, which is one of the things that's happening.
So the argument, we were chatting about this before the show started, and we perhaps disagree about this a little bit. We've not had enough disagreement tonight. Often we disagree about stuff. People love it. We've not disagreed that much tonight. But we agree about a great deal in general. I said that I think it's not true that if the BBC disappeared, that we would immediately, the sort of the cliche is we would be like America and all the news would be like Fox. And the point is, in America, not all the news is like Fox. You have pretty able networks, CNN, MSNBC, NBC. You have a range of really credible broadsheet papers, LA Times, Washington Post. Some of these are owned by very wealthy people. I'm not saying they're great, but their content, their editorial is quite similar to The Guardian, right? Mm-hmm. Certainly not the Daily Telegraph. Mm-hmm. Close to The Guardian and Daily Telegraph. Boston Globe, obviously New York Times. You've got 6 or 7 pretty impressive papers. And so I look at the US media environment, I look at the UK, and I don't necessarily buy the argument that, oh my God, the UK is so much better. I wonder if Sanders, again, was operating hypothetically in a media environment like Britain with the BBC, where you are so held back and constrained by establishment orthodoxy. I think it'd be a very, very different challenge he'd face. Look at, the most important piece of media that Sanders has done so far is the Joe Rogan interview, right?
He also did a Fox town hall where he was very good.
No, he was, okay. But in terms of eyeballs and in terms of podcast listens, the Rogan interview would have been tens of millions of people.
I mean, there's 10 million people on YouTube who watch the Joe Rogan Bernie Sanders interview. I don't know how many people watch the Fox
on
News
iTunes,
town hall.
At its peak on iTunes, Rogan gets, I think, 150 million a month.
Really?
Obviously, it's one of the most listened to podcasts in the world. Obviously, many of those people aren't in the United States. But anyway, okay, it's up there. Right? The Joe Rogan podcast is this thing which he did, and and you can see all the comments. I'm a conservative, didn't really know this guy. Really impressive, It really breached the ideological divide in American society. Very polarized, just like here. And I wonder, there's nothing like that here. And people could say, well, that's because Novara or Tribune aren't good enough. But the reality is, when you've got a national broadcaster like the BBC, 80% of TV news market share, 80% of radio news market share. Go to iTunes right now, look at the leading podcasts. Yeah, some of the Guardian, some of the Romaniacs or whatever. We might be like 30th in news, but most of them are the BBC in most areas. And the BBC is cannibalizing lots of the media landscape simply because of digital, the market mechanism doesn't work, as newspapers have found out. The incentives aren't there to produce stuff. So the BBC gets more and more market share, and it doesn't seem particularly useful for me, for the left, because the right, it's meant to immunise the discussion, inoculate the discussion from the right as well. But look, they've got the Daily Telegraph, they've got the Daily Mail, they've got the Murdoch media, whereas the left has nothing. And so you do effectively silence, I think, 25-30% of the public who have a really radical, trenchant critique of the status quo, and broadly speaking, they're voiceless. In America, I don't think that's the case. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think John McDonnell's position when he came on here was really smart about the BBC. So he was saying the BBC can be independent and oppositional to the extent that it's well funded. So if you cut their money, as the Conservative Party are doing, that's probably why they're doing it. Then they have to get rid of their their independent investigative departments and end up piggybacking off the corporate press. So I think you could have a more oppositional BBC than you currently have. I mean, also in terms of looking at the American system, it's more Wild West, right? So if you wanted to have a sort of Leninist strategy of how do you build a majority unencumbered by the moderating establishment forces, then potentially the United States gives you more opportunity. But I mean, if you look at it historically, I mean, it's a much more right-wing country than this. In terms of economic policy, for example, it's an incredibly right-wing country. And you can say the same things about proportional representation, right? It's a moderating. Proportional representation is in a way a moderating force, but it means that you end up with more centre-left governments than right-wing governments. And I do think that the American media system leaves you incredibly vulnerable to authoritarian, right-wing, warmongering governments, as history shows it has produced. So I think to get rid of the BBC would be a massive risk, and it would mean that. And I do think that people.
I'm not suggesting
that. There's a reason that Rupert Murdoch wants to undermine the BBC, right?
Do you think that? I'm not suggesting that. I think public service, even the United States has got public service broadcast. I favour the BBC doing news and current affairs. Where I'm concerned about it is I think at the moment it's actually inhibiting a lot of other media doing well. That's my view.
I don't really buy that. I think that's just an excuse that's made by.
Well, how else do you? No, I'm not talking about big market actors. For instance, I'm a big fan of the McChesney voucher. The idea that people can fund media of their choosing. There's Robert McChesney, media scholar.
That's a totally different.
Yeah,
that's not an either or, is it? You can have a well-funded BBC and then also have a voucher system whereby people can fund.
But
their own
there's a massive
there's
a massive centralisation of news and current affairs in this country. Huge, and it's not just about look at in Norway, for instance. In Norway, local papers are heavily subsidised, so you have a very vibrant local press. In this country, all that money, fundamentally, the BBC is still a multi-billion-pound organisation. It still has immense amounts of money. And the question is, if you care about the public interest, good journalism, holding power to account, do you want that all being spent in London with people ventriloquising arguments made by this or that minister in Westminster, or do you want good local journalism? Now, I'm not saying it's a zero-sum game. We should have both. But I wonder, how valuable really is a lot of the current affairs journalism that the BBC does? How valuable is BBC Question Time? I'm not sure. How valuable is the Today programme? A lady goes on the Today programme and she says, in work men shouldn't be able to talk about football because it alienates other members of staff. That then becomes a clip on the BBC website and it becomes one of their most looked at stories. This, to me, is the definition of a pseudo-event. Right? Just like Lawrence Fox going on Question Time. The BBC, because of clicks, because of eyeballs, because of social media, increasingly is generating these pseudo-events to amplify its own audience statistics. But that's not what journalism is meant to be.
A stat I'm thinking of is how many Americans believe that climate change is a hoax. And I think we'll look it up the next time we have a video clip. But I think a way you could say as to why the BBC is a valuable institution to have is that if you look at its absence, which is the United States, and PBS, public. Yeah. What does PBS stand for? I don't know. That's
public service, public broadcasting, whatever.
Public broadcasting service, I suppose. That's tiny.
Yeah.
Everyone watches either Fox News or CNN.
Yeah.
So you live in two different life worlds. One of them is telling you that climate change is a hoax and that all Mexicans are rapists. One of them is telling you that that basically corporations are good, but you shouldn't be racist. And then, obviously, I don't have the most sophisticated analysis of American cable channels, but half of the population then is in the life world of Fox News, and they don't believe that climate change exists, right? So the BBC is at least, it plays a sort of anchoring role, right, and it is way more accountable than Fox News is. It's way more accountable than anything which just answers to Rupert Murdoch.
You say that, but we've just come out of a huge conspiracy theory, which is that the EU is to blame for everything and all the problems of this country's politics can be laid at the door of Brussels. And in many ways, that was just as unevidenced as climate change. Well, and yet the BBC,
the existence of climate change is more, is a more solid. Yeah. Factual. That climate change exists is a more solid factual statement than the EU doesn't cause any of Britain's problem.
No, but there's 30-40% of the country that thinks that the EU was responsible for, the data's out there regarding the 2016 referendum, and nobody thinks that, it's a democracy. Ultimately, those people want to pursue that course of action. But nobody thinks the debate around Britain's membership of the European Union was particularly well informed. And so I wonder, you're saying that we've just had this batshit referendum. We had, obviously we left on Friday. We can talk about that briefly in a minute, perhaps. People saying, why do you want to leave? Ultimately, people gave very emotive reasons. And that's fine. The left has to also engage on that terrain as well. But it wasn't like, well, actually, I want us to leave because of X, Y, Z. They weren't particularly informed.
Bad things happen in countries with powerful public service broadcasting.
No, I just don't think...
It's a question of degree, isn't it?
I just don't think... Most people's engagement with the BBC is not the Today programme. It's 6 o'clock news. Are they really going to take... Is there a takeaway about climate change from 6 o'clock news? Probably not.
No, there has started to be, actually. They're covering it more than they used to. I mean, because of public pressure.
And also,
I'm
I
sure
don't know.
Fox News isn't
I don't
covering
know
more than
attitudes
it
around
is
climate change. They might not be as positive as you think they are, because people's main sources of news are Facebook or the tabloids. Let's find out. If people are in the comments, let's find out. I'm not as confident as Michael is. It wasn't that long ago. The Sunday Times, for instance, said that HIV couldn't be contracted by heterosexual people. That was under Andrew Neil's watch, by the way, in the 1980s. Anyway, this is one for later on. We've got 1,488 people watching. We've only got 581 thumbs up. I want you to hit the thumbs up button. You don't have to do anything else. It doesn't cost you a penny. And also subscribe, because tomorrow we've got a great show on. We've got 2 shows, 2 great guests. Can I say one of them?
No, don't say either, actually.
Don't say either. They're both huge. So to make sure you watch it, because you might forget, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell button so you get the notification. I can absolutely promise you, you won't regret it. We've got some other great interviews over the course of the week. We've got Anthony Lowenstein on Thursday, just confirmed his new book on the war on drugs. And then on Wednesday, we've got Phil Miller, who's just done a fantastic book on British mercenaries. Really, really interesting book. So don't miss out. Hit the subscribe button. I would like to see Aaron as DG. No, that'd be a huge mistake. It has to be Seamus Milne. We're going to go to questions in a second. You wanted to quickly touch up before we do this Jacobin piece about Latin America and Venezuela.
Yeah, so I feel like, I'll go to it in a moment. I just feel like there was a couple of things that we, in terms of if we were pitching this as advice to the American left about what they can learn from what went wrong here. And one of them, I think, is you need to look in advance about what you're going to get attacked for, choose a stance and respond to it. And it seems at this point like one of the attacks that's going to be made against Bernie Sanders is his support for left-wing Latin American governments, which obviously none of us would consider, a check against his name, but could potentially be weaponized in that way by the American press. And I thought Michael Brooks and Ben Burgess just had a good argument as to potentially how he could pivot and turn that around. So we can probably get that quote up now. So they talk about, the article is talking about how Cuba, Venezuela, one of the reasons they're in the state they are is because of American interventions. And they say, none of this means that governments in Cuba, Venezuela, or elsewhere in the region lack agency, or that the political choices they make in response to US aggression can't be legitimately criticized. So that's to sort of say, every time Bernie Sanders makes a criticism of Venezuela and all the tankies are in his replies saying like he's sold people out, it's like, no, it is actually fine to criticize the governments of these places. It does, however, mean that any adult discussion of these matters has to start with acknowledging the 400-ton elephant in the room, the role of the world's dominant imperial hegemon in crushing attempts by Latin American governments to replicate FDR's New Deal or Scandinavia's social democracies. For all the talk of Venezuela's economic collapse being an indictment of socialism, the fact is that even at the height of Chavez's welfare state, Venezuela's public sector was smaller than the public sectors of many European countries. The difference is that places like Norway and Sweden can move in that direction without having to worry about the United States partnering with local plutocrats to sponsor death squads or carry out military coups. And what they're talking about there, so I could have introduced it a bit better actually, is that when Bernie Sanders is asked, are you going to turn the United States into Venezuela? He says, no, I don't take inspiration from Venezuela, I take inspiration from Scandinavia, which is also a correct answer. I want to make America more like Scandinavia. But then they will inevitably go through his past and say, well, why did you say this positive thing about Cuban healthcare? Why did you say this positive thing about Chavez? And I don't know if he did say positive things about Chavez. I think what this is giving is a really good way to explain why you held those positions, why you still hold those positions, and use that as an excuse to talk about the fact that the reason that these systems failed, or not necessarily failed, but the downsides happened in Latin America was because it's difficult to build a social democracy when you've got an imperial power that's willing to fund death squads in your country if you do even the most modest redistribution of wealth.
Impossible, not just difficult.
Yeah,
impossible.
Yeah. And I think that point of saying that the public sector is bigger in many European countries than it ever was in Venezuela is a really good response to a question that the problem with Venezuela was socialism. You say no. The problem was poor governance. And one of the reasons there's poor governance in Venezuela is because America constantly intervened any time they had a government that was doing something that was relatively popular with the people. So I think that could be a good answer, and they should agree on that and stick to it.
Yeah,
because that was another problem.
Same with Iran, same with Mossadegh in 1953, the mid-50s. You get it wasn't even a socialist government, sort of a nominally social democratic, wants to bring oil into public ownership. It's overthrown. 25 years later, you get the Iranian Revolution. I view that as quite an inexplicable thing to happen when you have a democratic prime minister subject to a coup d'etat. I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to then say, well, obviously, democracy isn't going to work here because the world's hegemon doesn't think we're allowed to have it. I'm not suggesting that should be pursued, but it's entirely explicable. Let's go to questions. If we can just get these questions up. Is there anything else? Actually, before we do, because this is really funny, can we get the Dershowitz clip up? Because it's one of the major criticisms of Jeremy Corbyn was his inability to deal with anti-Semitism. And you would think that Sanders is immune from such claims, given that he would be the first American Jewish president of the United States. But Alan Dershowitz, lawyer to Jeffrey Epstein, doesn't think that's the case. Let's go to that clip. He was speaking to Larry King.
If Sanders gets the nomination, I will actively campaign against him. I will follow him from state to state, urging Americans to vote against him.
Why?
The man went to England and endorsed Jeremy Corbyn for the prime ministership. That, for me, was a red line. Jeremy Corbyn is one of the men who has most promoted and tolerated anti-Semitism in England and in Europe. And anybody who went and endorsed him, I am going to campaign vigorously against. I sure hope that Sanders doesn't get the nomination, because if he does, I have him in my, I'm going to be there pointing out what he has done over the years.
I've interviewed Bernie Sanders many times. I've never heard him make an anti-Semitic comment. And then Alan, he's Jewish.
So is Norman Finkelstein. So is Noam Chomsky. So is Gilad Atzmon, some of the worst people in terms of not promoting Jewish values are Jews. That's no excuse. Karl Marx was a Jew, at least a Jew by heritage. So that's no excuse. I don't think that Sanders is an anti-Semite. I think he tolerates anti-Semitism among the hard left in the Democratic Party. I don't think he's done enough to condemn it. He says he speaks the words, but then he does the deeds. And I think that what he did in England, going over and endorsing Jeremy Corbyn, crossed the red line for me.
I love the bit where Larry King goes, but he's Jewish. And then he has to go, well, look, Jews can be quote unquote self-hating Jews. But he doesn't say that. And then he says Karl Marx was Jewish, but then of course Dershowitz's position is that Karl Marx wasn't really Jewish. So he's kind of contradicting himself constantly. But anyway, do you think this is a line of attack which will be repeated against Sanders? Obviously, it was so successful against. I'm not talking about whether or not the claims are verified or not. There was obviously clearly an anti-Semitic presence in the Labour Party, which wasn't dealt with effectively. But if you were looking for an issue by which to discredit Bernie Sanders' anti-racist credentials, you could say, well, he's connected. And this has already happened, right, with Ilhan Omar. He's connected to these people. They're anti-Semitic. How do you think that will play out? Do you think Bernie Sanders can mitigate that, or will it be altogether different just because he is Jewish?
I think there's a number of reasons why it will be. Also, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how effective this attack will be, and obviously it will be repeated. Obviously, it will be repeated. The extent to which it's repeated will be determined by how successful it is. Obviously, people went hard on Corbyn about this when they realised it was actually working, right? To discredit him. So. Obviously not denying that there was some anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. But I suppose some of the reasons it's going to be different with Bernie Sanders is, one, it's not a membership party. So whereas, they try and smear Bernie Sanders by association with Ilhan Omar, he can have a conversation with Ilhan Omar. Obviously, Ilhan Omar isn't anti-Semitic, and they can talk about what their common response is going to be. You can't do that with 500,000 Labour Party members. So the Times could go through Facebook page after Facebook page and say, this person's a Labour Party member, why haven't you excluded them? Yeah. Whereas Sanders, the way the system works, he's not really responsible for anyone.
Do you not think they can go, this person's a registered Democrat?
Well, I mean, they can, but he's got quite a simple... the problem with Labour was that they were always saying, we're going to speed up our processes, we will do with that. If you've got a simple answer, which is just look, there's nothing I can do about that. I mean, many of the people who support me might think horrendous things. I've got no idea. I don't endorse that. So it is easier for him. Well, it's easier for a number of reasons. One, he doesn't have a parliamentary Labour Party. So I think one of the reasons why the anti-Semitism stories were so easy to create news in this country was because there were always MPs who were sort of fanning the flames. I think that would be harder to do in the United States. Two, I mean, his history is quite different to Corbyn's. I don't think Bernie Sanders has been as involved in Palestinian activism. So there'll be sort of less material to play on or take out of context.
True.
Which is a big one, right? And And yeah, he's slightly better at, decisive responses
And why,
than Corbyn ever
and
was.
why would he be as involved in Palestinian solidarity activism as Jeremy Corbyn? Because the Brits are the primary people for fucking causing this issue.
Although the Americans are now the primary country sustaining it.
No, but the Balfour Declaration, we have a great show on this. I'm reading a fantastic book about this at the moment, and it really brings home the historic role of Britain and the whole palaver of the Middle East. Not just in regards to Palestine, but Syria with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, etc., etc. So it's really important, and it's really to Jeremy Corbyn's credit that as a British politician, he dealt with these issues, because there's a huge geopolitical legacy which we're not really taking responsibility for in this country. Let's take these questions. Harlech asks, hello Harlech, is the Labour leadership election still too early to call?
Yeah. There's a clear favourite, but I mean, obviously anything could happen at this point. We've still got a while. I mean,
how long have we got? Because people keep saying it's a couple of months, but the reality is the ballots drop and people tend to respond within 72 hours. So when do ballots drop?
I'm pretty sure they drop in 3 weeks' time.
So basically we've got a month, realistically.
Yeah, to be honest, that isn't that much time, is it? And I suppose what we were talking about is that, Rebecca Long-Bailey hasn't landed any particularly effective blows on Keir Starmer yet. So he does seem to be fairly confident in his lead, which is why he's run a fairly lackadaisical campaign. So he doesn't seem to have been tested. He seems to feel fairly comfortable that his record and his image as looking somewhat prime ministerial in the eyes of Labour Party members, or Labour Party members assuming that the public will see him as prime ministerial, whatever prejudices that might be reflecting. But I mean, he has got a good CV. He rose to the top of his field. So, I mean, he's leading the pack. But, I mean, there's a lot for Rebecca Long-Bailey to work with to try and catch up with him. I mean, Lisa Nandy, there's a weird thing that's going on in the British press where everyone's saying she's got a second place strategy, where if she just peels off the second place votes of Starmer fans and RLB stands, maybe she can come through the middle. But that ignores how preferential voting works.
No.
Because unless she comes second in first choices, she's out in the first round. And if she's out in the first round, then it's only her second preferences that get redistributed. So it is between Keir Starmer and Rebecca Long-Bailey. And at the moment, Starmer is miles ahead.
Yeah, I think she's going to win. Well, right now he's going to win on second preferences quite comfortably, isn't he? I think the only time Starmer looked uncomfortable was the week after I wrote a story about his staffers. If I'm being deadly serious, that might sound quite arrogant. But, he's kind of flustered. He said, I'm not going to answer questions about my stuff. And there were quite legitimate political questions to ask in regard to two.
It's actually the only tough question he's been asked in the whole campaign.
It's kind of crazy. It's kind of surprising. And that's not meant as Keir Starmer, have to stop Keir Starmer or whatever. The guy is going to be the next leader of the Labour Party. People said that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't subject to enough tough questions to bring all this stuff and scrutiny.
Yeah, Starmer's been subjected to no tough questions this whole time. That's why I want to get him on Tisky Sour, but we'll wait and see.
Nothing on his record as Director of Public Prosecutions. Very little on his parliamentary record because he only entered in 2015, but still very little. Very little on Brexit. Very odd. I mean, I agree with you. I think right now it's a really low energy campaign. It's insipid. And you can blame all the candidates for that, but ultimately that suits Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer was asked these questions by We Own It, nationalisation kind of pressure group. All the candidates were asked, what would you nationalise? What would you bring into public ownership? Lisa Nandy, Rebecca Long-Bailey said basically everything that was in the 2019 manifesto. Starmer hasn't even answered it. Now, one answer is he just hasn't had the time, maybe. Another is he just doesn't want to commit. And he wouldn't commit under any circumstances. I think the most likely explanation is he doesn't have to commit.
Yeah.
He might want to nationalise everything, for all we know. I just think that
I'll leave my options. If I'm going to win anyway, I'll leave my options open.
Yeah, why would you?
Maximum leeway is what he wants.
Why would you? Master of what you don't say and a slave to what you do, as a wise person once put it. I think it was Balthazar Gracian. Coping Method asks, will a mass membership exodus entail a Starmer win? Will a mass membership exodus happen if Starmer wins the leadership? Will thousands of members leave the party, Michael?
It's too early to say, isn't it? I mean, if he wins, then presumably there's quite a lot of support for him among the party membership. Do you know what I mean?
Would he be a divisive... Corbyn was a divisive leader in so much as some people joined to not vote for him and then they left. I mean, could it be like that but more significant if Starmer won?
Yeah, I think a fair number of people could leave over the 5 years. I mean, I think that's the worrying thing with Keir Starmer winning is that you've got 5 years for him to shift Labour's policy and 5 years for him potentially to change. I mean, I don't have any evidence he's going to do this. I'm just saying he's going to have a lot of leeway to do this, to change rules so that you limit membership power, so that you shift the party towards the centre. And I don't think there'll be an instant exodus if Keir Starmer wins, because from what we know of him, he's not a particularly offensive character. I think if there were an exodus, it would be a drip feed over the next 4 years as various compromises are made and various stitch-ups happen.
Do you think how possible is that though? Because the thing is, his internal political base is very volatile. It has people on the real right, people who want 400,000 members kicked out, basically, right? Some of those people are voting for him, and it's also got people on the left. And so I wonder how quickly that internal base of support could... Now, clearly, he's always going to have a majority of the MPs. He'd probably have much of the media on side. But in terms of the actual membership, it could be the case that 2/3 of the people that vote for him very quickly if he did pursue that direction of travel, particularly if he wasn't polling particularly well. If you go right, and if all of a sudden Labour are leading all the polls by 10 points and they win local elections, I think he can do that.
Yeah,
that's what Blair did, right? But Blair couldn't do a bunch of stuff if Labour was getting hammered, and so I think it's going to be a very tough one for him to navigate.
We'd quite possibly get a bounce. He might get an immediate bounce, actually.
I think he would do, wouldn't he?
Because I think the party's already at the biggest it's ever been in modern history now, because it went up again for this leadership election. So it could go up to 800,000 or something, and then straight after the election, because there is, as we learned in the general election, the sort of Romaniac centrist section of the electorate's not very big, but there are some people committed to that. Some people will. Some people might join the party.
But that's the thing. A lot of those people will be joining. That's the thing. He's a real. This is where his power is coming from right now. He's like this kind of floating signifier. A lot of the people that are voting for Starmer will be like, "Yeah, we want to rejoin the European Union." And then the reality is, if a Labour leader wants to be electable, they're going to have to say, "Well, we're not even going to be in. We're not going to have freedom of movement immediately." And that's I just think it's a very volatile base. Whereas Rebecca Long Bailey, even if she's coming second at the moment, you can look at her base and you go, these people broadly agree on all of these things. I don't really think that's the case with Starmer, and that doesn't matter if he pulls away. And it's perfectly possible. We're already seeing problems with regards to Brexit, with regards to how Number 10 is treating the lobby. Today, for instance, in 10 Downing Street, the journalist press pack. So he could begin to catch up, and that would mitigate issues. I think in terms of making profound political changes as well within the party, I think, famous last words, I think that might take a year or two. I think he'd be very, very brave to do that straight away. Either do it straight away and alienate lots of people, or do it gradually. And he doesn't strike me as the personality type to pursue the former. But anyway, what are your thoughts on that? No, nothing.
Way too. I mean, the optimistic vision is that he will be, because he has respect across factions, he will have actually more leeway to keep some left-wing policies, and he'll have some credibility in the country. But I mean, there was a vision which I suppose people like Paul Mason were pushing at the beginning of the campaign, which is that he can sort of stand above the factions and genuinely bring different people on side and potentially bring the left-wing membership on side, whilst also, being a genuine unifying figure in a sense.
Which is possible.
And I think theoretically that is possible. I do think you can sort of put out a course for Labour policy which does bring together all the various sections of the party. And also, if you wanted to do that, what better position to pitch left than being knighted and an ex-DPP, because you've got the sort of establishment credentials to have permission to go that far left in a way that Corbyn, because he didn't have those established credentials, didn't. So if you wanted a left programme, Keir Starmer would be ideal, but that's only if he decides to do it, right? So that's an incredibly optimistic vision which relies on Keir Starmer being a person which he hasn't really proved himself to be, at least in the last decade. And in the campaign so far, I mean, I've got less enthusiastic, I was never particularly enthusiastic, but I've got more and more worried about Keir Starmer as the campaign's gone on, because he doesn't seem to have bothered to commit to anything left-wing over the period. And I do think he's running a bit of a flip-floppy campaign that doesn't bode well for his eventual leadership.
Also, forget the policies for a second, because you could be a vacuous suit and you could still poll well, at least initially. He could have been, I suppose the person I'm thinking of here would be like a Trudeau-style figure, right? But it doesn't strike me that he could even be that. He being underwhelming right now, keeping the race low key suits him. But looking at the media they're putting out, their videos, etc., his tone, his oratory. It's just quite, I don't really see how it gets people inspired. I could be wrong, because people forget, there are big structural obstacles here for Labour. Scotland, Leave seats, media. These are big, and even a hugely talented person would struggle. Starmer, without that mass movement, not so sure. This is a great question from Khosrow Zangane. Sounds Farsi. What would a US-UK relationship look like with a President Sanders? I mean, that's a big question, isn't it? Because we could have a British government, Tory government with a majority of 80, negotiating bilateral arrangements with Ireland, with a Sinn Féin-led government, and with the United States with a self-proclaimed democratic socialist as president. That would have big ramifications for a post-Brexit trading relationship, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a Bernie Sanders presidency, because we wouldn't have signed a trade deal at that point. And presumably Bernie Sanders isn't going to be desperate to sell us chlorinated chicken and allow... I mean, I suppose we were talking about this during the general election, right? Which is that there's two ways of looking at... And it will be a political issue for Donald Trump and for Bernie Sanders that Americans pay way more for pharmaceuticals than any other country on earth. And so both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are making an argument that Americans should pay the same as the rest of the world. But Donald Trump's argument is that countries like Britain should pay more. And Bernie Sanders' argument will be countries like the USA should pay less. So ideally what you'd get is a sort of levelling up, not of prices, but a levelling up of rights and of quality of service in healthcare and workers' rights if Bernie Sanders comes to power. I mean, I don't think Boris Johnson would be an ally on the world stage if if Bernie Sanders was trying to increase workers' rights and environmental standards the world over. But I mean, Boris Johnson wouldn't be powerful enough to block him.
People are asking for an episode on the Irish election. Obviously, I think that's happening end of this week.
Yeah, it's happening on Saturday. I'm trying to sort out an episode for Monday.
I mean, we've got contacts in Sinn Féin and on the left, but they're all in Ireland and they're all canvassing hard. I don't know if you've got anybody over here in the UK that could do it.
Yeah, if you've got suggestions for London-based people who could talk about the Irish election on Monday, put them in the comments. I've asked Ronan Burton-Shaw, but he's away, potentially in Ireland for that period of time.
Makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's not very far away.
I mean, we should probably go over there at some point, actually, especially if Sinn Féin do well. More questions, please, with the rocket emoji.
You can also look on Twitter.
Oh, yeah. You go on. You look at the hashtag on Twitter.
This is a good question from Anonymous2000 on the hashtag Tiskisour. Do you think the establishment has more power to influence people's voting patterns in the US or the UK? Also, aren't the Democrats making a mistake of appearing so divided? Trump has to be beaten, whoever the Democrat candidate is. So 2 questions there. Where is the establishment more powerful in terms of influencing people's opinions? I feel like we kind of discussed that in the BBC question, right? In the sense that the BBC is an anchoring institution which is less right-wing than the corporate-owned press in the United States, but it is also more dominant.
Is that true?
Well,
Andrew Neil was their sort of anchor man, and Andrew Neil, was the editor of the Sunday Times. He was involved in Fox News at the end of in the early 1990s.
Yeah, but watch Fox News. I mean, Fox News is so much more right-wing than...
Yeah, no, but Andrew Neil was helping build that. He wouldn't talk like that publicly because he doesn't want to give the game away. But
well, he wouldn't talk like that publicly because he's employed by the BBC. That's the point, right? So
but he can convey and maximize those political interests in quite a clever...
People are restrained on the BBC in the way they're not on Fox News. But as you say, for whatever reason, a sort of plural media environment has flourished recently in the US in a way that it hasn't quite done here.
I think part of it's got to be the BBC. Anyway, next question.
Are the Democrats making a mistake by appearing so divided? I wouldn't worry about it. I mean, they'll all rally around the candidate when the time comes.
That's it. And division's not a bad thing. You're having a contest over idea. That's democracy, right? If you were unified around a bad candidate with terrible policies who's going to lose, that's really bad. Division is to be welcome.
It was fine for Donald Trump.
I mean, that's my worry with Labour is that even if Starmer wins, whoever wins for Labour, I'm not going to be a wrecker. I'm going to set. Any of them was a far better prospect for leading the country than the Tories. But you got to test them. When people were saying, don't write this piece about his staffers, First of all, there's a public interest case. Secondly, the second he gets the top job, if he gets the top job, far worse is headed his way.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just like, we need
and especially like the Democratic candidates in this, you need to fucking test them Like Hillary Clinton she uses like a mad excuse. Bernie was too critical of me, and that's why I lost to Donald Trump. That's not. If you'd actually responded to Bernie properly, as in by having some actual policies, maybe you would have beaten Donald Trump. It was that if she'd listened to Bernie, she could have won.
Yeah. No, we'll be getting some Irish people on regarding the Ireland stuff. Don't worry. Any more questions? Any thoughts on... We haven't talked about it enough. Maybe it's for the final question. Let's talk about Lisa Nandy.
Yeah, or are you looking at Neverlord 666? Controversial opinion, Nandy is a better socialist candidate than RLB.
No, we can talk about that too. But the same person, Netherlord 666, has also said, any thoughts on Lisa Nandy's OBE comments over the weekend?
No.
Which were to the effect that they shouldn't be a mention of the Empire.
Yeah, I thought that was smart. Order of British Excellence as opposed to Order of British Empire.
Is that what she said?
Yeah.
I didn't know it was excellence.
I think it's fine, good policy. Labour should probably adopt it.
Great policy.
Yeah. But is she a better socialist than Rebecca Long-Bailey? No. I mean, there's positive things to say about her candidacy, but that she's more of a socialist than Rebecca Long-Bailey isn't one of them. I mean, we were talking earlier, it was in the Times that she was having a coffee or whatever with Tony Blair
tea and biscuits
in the run-up to the to the 2016 coup. From what I've heard, basically from the start of Jeremy Corbyn winning, she was, caucusing with people, talking about how they might overthrow him. By all accounts, it wasn't the case that she was supportive of that leadership and tried to make it work, and only dropped out when she saw it couldn't possibly function anymore, which is kind of the story she spins. Is she's saying, I was supportive of the project, but when it seemed like it couldn't work, I dropped out. I don't think she was a team player in that period. Having spoken to her, sort of like I was on This Week with her, it's kind of contrarian when it comes to the left. I've seen tweets from her sort of like, oh yeah, the big problem with Labour's climate policy is it didn't try and reach out to workers and say that also you could have jobs with whilst tackling climate change. And it's like, have you read about the Green New Deal? There was so many, whatever your criticisms of Jeremy Corbyn, if you can't be a team player when a socialist leader is trying to be prime minister, you're not a very good socialist.
And it's not just that, it's also on like the nationalisation stuff. I won't bring these things into public ownership because I think we should favour co-ops and stuff. And people are like,
that was in the fucking manifesto, yeah.
Alternative models of ownership, John McDonnell, Rebecca Long-Bailey, where was your input? And then, I like the Preston model. And she's pitching herself as somebody who's involved in the Preston model. It's like, the Preston model was adopted and pushed and amplified, first of all, obviously by councillors in Preston, after Matthew Brown became the head of the Preston Council. And then it was really articulated at a national level by the Labour leadership, not by you. So, I look at Keir Starmer, I look at Lisa Nandy, and what I see is two highly competent politicians who want to get to the top. It's absolutely fine. And they've played the game very well. They've made the right choice at the right time with one critical misstep for both. That was 2016.
But much worse for Lisa Nandy.
Well, both of them, though. Both have plotted every single step to appeal to a membership to the best possible extent to become a potential leader or a very senior figure in the party. The one time they didn't do that in 2016 because they thought that Corbyn would go. And I think, to me, that shows two things. Firstly, bad political judgment, because it was quite clear that it was always very unlikely for Corbyn to go, even if like more MPs.
Well, there was a moment actually where it seemed like maybe he wouldn't get on the ballot. Then we would have had Owen Smith.
But that was like a bureaucratic. That was a bureaucratic thing, right?
Yeah.
But it never looked like, short of that they were gonna stop him. And so I just think you that's when you have to judge politicians. Is okay. When did they cock up? When did they do something which was out of step? And that was 2016. And supporters of those guys would say you can't judge somebody by just by one decision. Actually, I would. It's why I like Angela Rayner. She's running for deputy leader. I really like Angela Rayner. She was loyal to Jeremy Corbyn a year after he'd been chosen as leader of the party. It's why I like Emily Thornberry. I think her position on Remain and stuff's a bit weird or whatever, but I really like her.
The thing with Thornberry, she'd kind of burnt her bridges with the other side of the party as well. But yeah, fine.
But whatever. It was,
she was a good team player until mid-2019.
Yeah. And I think that's really, really key. And I think, and Starmer, again, whatever differences we may have, at least he came back into the shadow cabinet. Lisa Nandy never wanted to serve under Jeremy Corbyn, ever, from the start to the finish. So, like you say, how is she a good socialist? Anyway, we've got 1,542 watching. Great. We're going to wrap up shortly. I guess I may take one more question. Put it in with a rocket emoji in the comments or on Twitter, #TiskySour. 809 thumbs up. Come on, guys. Let's get to 1,000 before the end of the show. Hit the thumbs up button. Doesn't cost you a thing. And if you really like our content, go to support.novaramedia.com. Help us build a new media for different politics. We've got a lot more shows coming up. We've got 4 this week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. 2 tomorrow, in fact. So 5. And we can only do it with your support, financial or otherwise. So thanks for that. Or we could just wrap up. We've been going for like 80 minutes now, haven't we? Any more questions you want to take, Michael? Any really strike out? We've done Nandi, we've done the leadership, we've done Long Bailey, we've done...
Let's take this one. Thomas Randall, if Bernie Sanders was asked to bail out banks again, like Obama, which could happen if the market crashes, do you think he would capitulate and do that? What you'd do is you'd bail out the banks, but in return for nationalisation, which this time around you might, be able to do. In Adam Tooze's book, he writes in what's it called, Crashed. He writes very well about the role that Obama ended up playing in that period of time, which was to, he potentially some of his decisions did avert a crisis that could have been much worse than it was. So in terms of like a moderate Keynesianism that prevented absolute meltdown that would have hurt the lives of ordinary people. But he pitched himself as, look, I'm actually here to protect you guys, the city, Wall Street. I am here to keep the masses with their pitchforks away from you. So you should do what I say, which is going to be incredibly mild, and then it ends up getting watered down. Whereas I think Bernie Sanders would use the opportunity of a financial crisis on Wall Street to try and nationalize the banks. Obviously, you would have some problems in terms of, what Congress and the Senate allow you to do. But
although Obama did in 2008, right? It was very close to not getting through.
It was close, but he had to make a bunch of compromises as well. But I think Bernie Sanders would be saying, not that, look, I'm going to be here to calm down the pitchforks. He's been saying, like, look, I've got the guys with the pitchforks and they're behind me, so you better fucking do what I say. Hopefully that's the optimistic vision.
I think also the left, if there is a crisis like that, and it's very dangerous to sort of rely on a crisis as a basis of your political vision, but if there was a crisis like that, and you had even Boris Johnson at number 10 Downing Street, or even, not Trump, because he's just, Joe Biden in the White House, I think the forces on the left, whether it's organised labour, whether it's the intellectual framework which has been laid down, the response would be entirely different to 2008. So I think you're right. Sanders would probably have to capitulate to some extent. He would have to capitalise banks. He'd have to say, here's a $40 billion loan or whatever, so make sure you can work on a short-term basis. But also we want equity in the bank, and we want you to make sure that you give X amount of lending to these kinds of businesses. Oh, and by the way, we want to take these off your books and bring them in. We want the federal government to own this 5% share of this company that you own, because it's, we can expand the green economy. So I agree with you. But that's not just because of the presidency. It's not just because you've got a left-winger who could win the presidency. Also, those ideas on the left have become increasingly hegemonic, I think, over the last decade. Right. You've been great.
Thank you for having me.
Michael is hosting 2 pieces of content with 2 great people tomorrow. 1 may not happen, 2 may not happen.
Follow us on Twitter and then tune in potentially at 7 p.m. and hopefully you'll have 2 great guests, but I don't want to announce before they're confirmed.
They're both great. So hit the subscribe button. My name's Aaron Bastani. You've been great. I will see you tomorrow because I'll be along Michael as one of those great guests comes on board. See you there, same time, same place, 8 p.m. before that 7 p.m. Good night.